Can I still see your screen? Great. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Kim Brown, and I'm with the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, Transition and Employment Projects, and also with the Montana Deaf Blind Project. And Teresa Baldry and I will be your moderators for today. We do have live captioning available for today's session. To access the captions, open the captioning link that I've posted in our question box in a new browser window. And if you do not see the question box on your screen, look to the upper right-hand area of your screen. You should see an orange box with a white arrow in it. Click on that. That will open the dialog box and you can see the question screen. The link for captions is there. And again, if you click on that, it will open a new browser window. You'll be able to see the captions. You can resize that browser window so that you'll have it at the bottom of your screen as you watch today's slideshow. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Montana Transition Resources Project, which is funded through a contract with Children's Special Health Services at the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services. The statements shared in the presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the department. We also have ASL interpretation available today. You should see the interpreter and her webcam on your screen. You can resize this if you need the image to be larger. If you hover over the webcam image of the interpreter, you'll see two arrows that will allow you to expand that window if you'd like the interpreter to be larger. All attendees are currently muted. If you want to ask the presenter a question or to make a comment, please type your question or comment into the question box. Again, you can find that in the dialog area by clicking on that white arrow inside the orange box on the upper right-hand side of your screen. For those of you who requested Montana Office of Public Instruction Renewal Unit credit when you registered, we will email that to you after the webinar, and it can take a couple of weeks to get that out to you. You must have pre-registered in order to receive the OPI credit. We do send a certificate of attendance link that will go in the follow-up email you receive tomorrow. Today's webinar is being recorded for the Transition and Employment Project's Resource Library, and by participating in the webinar, you grant permission for any chats or questions that you submit through the webinar platform to be recorded. And the video for today's webinar will be posted to the training archives page, and I'll put the link for that in your question or chat window in just a couple of minutes. The handouts for today's session, and there are 2 handouts, are available for download in the handouts section of your dialog box. And again, that can be found in the same area as the questions or chat box. We have a short survey or evaluation that we ask you to complete after the webinar. The link for that will go out in the email that you receive as a follow-up, and I'll also post the link to that in the chat or question box later today during the session. With that, I would like to go ahead and introduce and turn it over to our speaker. We're absolutely delighted today to be able to welcome Dr. Erik Carter. We've been following his work for years and just sort of on a whim asked if he might be willing to come and do a couple of webinars for us. And when he said yes, we were thrilled. So we're excited to introduce to you Dr. Erik Carter. Dr. Carter is the Luther Sweet Endowed Chair in Disabilities at Baylor University and Executive Director of the Baylor Center for Developmental Disabilities. His research addresses strategies for supporting inclusion and belonging in schools, workplaces, and congregations for children and adults with disabilities. He's published widely in the areas of educational and transition services, including more than 300 articles, chapters, and other publications. And I will put the link for his website in the chat box in a little bit so you can go and read more about Dr. Carter's work. With that, I would like to turn it over to you, Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Kim. What a pleasure it is to be with all of you this afternoon. I know among a group of people who care deeply about the flourishing of our students and young people with disabilities in your communities. So I just want to begin by thanking you for this important role you're playing in creating schools and workplaces and communities where every person matters, where every person belongs. That's the work that makes me smile, and I'm grateful to be about it alongside of all of you. Yes, Kim said, I am a professor and a teacher trainer and have been involved in research in this area for about 25 years now, trying to change the landscape for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families in our communities, across our state, around our country. And so what I'd love to do in our time together is share some fresh insights about what it might mean to be a community that's more welcoming and embracing and valuing and needing of people with disabilities. Communities that move just beyond the thin veneer of inclusion towards something deeper and fuller. And for some of you, this isn't going to be fresh. It's going to affirm what you're already about, and that encourages me as well. But I think this is at the heart of what we're trying to do collectively as schools and as service systems and as advocacy groups to really promote the flourishing of people with disabilities in their communities together. So the talk is called Beyond Inclusion, Moving from Barriers to Belonging. And our time is brief, but we're going to talk about the place of belonging in our collective efforts to promote flourishing and thriving among families and individuals all across Montana. And I really want to provoke your thinking about what we mean when we say fostering communities of belonging and what it looks like to adopt the kinds of practices and attitudes and postures that really lead in those directions. And it's a conversation that matters because, as many of you know, our communities are not always welcoming places, and sometimes people encounter wounding more than welcoming. And so I want to help us think about what does it look like to bend those stories in that direction of really just wonderful, warm embrace and welcome of individuals of all abilities. Because belonging is not a special need, it's a human need, one that we all share, and one that our communities struggle to often live out well. So to set the stage for this conversation, I want to share a little bit of the sort of historical background of this work as we think about our fields of education and special education and how dramatically they've changed over the last 50 years of my own lifetime. I know some of you have been in this work for a long time, so this won't be new history to you. Others, this might be a fresh way to think about the progress we've made and the progress we still need to make. So bear with me as I kind of give a little bit of this history. At the time I was born, in 1973, so many students with disabilities were wholly excluded from public education, and not just education, but so many other community opportunities. If the picture on your screen of all of these circles reflects maybe a school or a community, we would say there were holes, and there were students and people missing from our communities. As a lot of our efforts towards new legislation and advocacy gained steam, so many opportunities that began to emerge for students with disabilities in the 70s and the 80s, for example, tended to be offered in largely segregated contexts, apart from anyone else who didn't have the same label. Special education schools, and those students grew up and graduated to specialized day programs and sheltered workshops and even institutional living. And what that meant is that for most students without disabilities, they were going to receive their formative education in the absence of their peers with disabilities. And so again, living lives separate and apart was the sort of the way things were at that time. As I was going through middle school and elementary school and high school, all of those years, the landscape changed even further. We saw this shift towards integration and mainstreaming, where students with disabilities were more and more part of everyday school and community life. And it was incredible progress, but what we saw so often is that the opportunities that opened up for our students still involved a certain separation, right? Different classes down that rarely traveled hallway, and large group homes tucked in untraveled parts of town, or even work enclaves where people with developmental disabilities were near, but not really among their coworkers without disabilities. And that's what this model really looked like: people near one another, but not really among one another. And of course, that takes us to the present day, where so often our conversations now are about the full inclusion of people with disabilities in the same classrooms and clubs and jobs and church activities and community groups as anyone else, right? That's the theme of what we've been talking about so often over the last 10 or so years. It's this movement from being apart from one another to being among one another, but now to being really with one another. I imagine you see 4 very different portraits of community up on in these images on your screen. And I share them for a few different reasons. One is I've talked about this as past history, but I imagine you might suspect that what you see on your screen isn't really past history. It's almost a map of what we see right now, present day, in each of our own states, across Montana, for example. You can find examples of separation and integration and exclusion, sometimes right alongside inclusion. But I also share them because I hope these images prompt your own reflection as you think about the schools that you work in or the communities you care about and are trying to change. Which of these pictures maybe most closely resembles what you see in your midst? And why are you stuck where you are, or where might you go next if we're thinking about this as maybe a journey? But the primary reason I share these is I think there's really one more maybe destination that we really are aiming for as we think about helping people live full and abundant lives in their communities. Young people talk about wanting to be more than just integrated or more than even just included. They talk about wanting to experience belonging. Right? We all want to belong in communities that matter to us. And I think we've arrived in that kind of place as a community when we stop seeing each other as the ins and the outs, and the labeled ones and the unlabeled ones, the members and the strangers. Instead, we're one community, diverse, absolutely, but every person is of equal and immeasurable worth. So there's a way we see each other differently in communities of belonging. And it also means we don't just share space, which is so much of what integration and inclusion emphasizes. And instead, we really share our lives. We become woven into relationship with one another. Friendships emerge out of time spent together, and we stay involved in each other's lives after school ends and after we clock out of work, after church ends, all 7 days of the week. A community of belonging is marked by living and learning in relationship with one another. And there's a big difference here between inclusion and belonging, between the difference between just being present, just being there, and actually having a real presence in your community. And I think for our communities, it's the difference between waiting for someone to arrive before we think about welcoming them and actually pursuing people who aren't yet there, aching because of their absence in some way. And that destination of belonging on the right of your screen, that's where I want to park now. Of what does that really mean to be a community, or to work towards being a community that's marked by that kind of posture of belonging? How would we even know that's the case of the communities that we care about, or the schools that we work in, or the workplaces that we're trying to open up and change? And belonging is one of those words that resonates with us so much because we know the joy that comes when we do belong, and we know viscerally this hurt and deep feeling when we don't. But defining belonging, that's a lot harder. And I think we have to be able to define it if we are to know whether we're moving our schools and communities in these directions. What does it look like for students with disabilities to experiencing belonging in inclusive schools, or workplaces, or colleges, or elsewhere? What would that really look like? Well, I think you can probably do some of your own reflection to think about, well, what would that look like for me and the communities that I care about? If I were to think about a community that I experience belonging in, what would tell me that's the case? And I imagine that would actually give you some of the answers to the question I'm posing. What does this look like for our students? But I think this core question drives so much of our work. We have to be able to articulate what are the things that mark belonging, what are the things that don't, and aim towards those things that do. And I didn't come on the webinar to give you the definitive word on what belonging means in your city, or for your family members, or for you yourself. What I want to do is share what we're hearing when we ask that question of people with disabilities and their families in our midst. As we ask that question about what tells you you belong in communities that matter to you, what are the themes that come up over and over and over? And here's what we've heard from nearly now a dozen years of projects around this belonging concept. When we talk to young people with disabilities and their families, they say, I know I belong when I'm present and when I'm invited, when I'm welcomed and when I'm known, when I'm accepted and when I'm supported, when I'm heard and befriended, and when I'm needed and when I'm loved. And I imagine those are going to resonate with you very quickly, because I imagine they are your own answers to that question of what does belonging mean to you. Turns out it's not merely about where you spend your day, although that matters. It's about the experiences and the relationships that you have in those places. And belonging isn't experienced because of a program or a service. It's because of the people that you encounter. And while we've made great strides around integration and inclusion, I think this place of belonging has been a real challenge for us to get to. And so I thought it'd be helpful in this first session to unpack why are each of these 10 areas so important? What's the research behind why this matters so much as we think about kind of what this looks like in our own local communities. So we're going to come back to this in the second session as we think about how to live this out in robust ways. But as I walk through these 10 areas of belonging, I just want you to be thinking about, in each of these areas, what are you seeing happen really well in your communities right now? And how do you know? What do you notice or see or hear that tells you that's the case? What could you do better or differently or more of? And what might you do next as you think about the movements that you're trying to spur as well? So I recognize that all of you are coming from a different vantage point, but begin to think about what does this look like in the communities that you're trying to change or advocate for or open up for the people that you serve or teach or work with or love. So we're going to start with being present, because that is really often the starting point for belonging. It's to be part of the ordinary experiences that take place in your community or school or workplace or elsewhere. And yet the primary barrier to belonging for many young people with disabilities is that they're absent from the classrooms and clubs and cafeterias in our local schools, or our colleges and community centers, our workplaces, even our worship spaces. It's hard for anyone to feel like you're part of the community from the outside looking in. And yet every available research study that we have points to the problem of absence, where absence is more common than presence in communities. Think about our schools. The first column displays the green is the number of, essentially all kids are supposed to go to school, right, and take interesting, wonderful classes. And that's the green is the bar of peers who are in those range of classes that a typical school might offer. On the left is the percentage of students with intellectual and developmental disabilities who spend most of their day in those same classes. It's less than half of students. They're mostly in separate classes or separate schools all day. In the middle set of columns, about half of all Americans go on to some kind of community college or four-year college right after high school, but that's true for only about a quarter of young adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And on the far right, about 75% of all Americans are sharing their time and talents in businesses throughout their community. That's true for just 1 in 5 adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are present in those workplaces. So there's a gap between the presence of people with and without disabilities, but the bigger gap is between the experiences that young people tell us that they want to have and the actual opportunities they have to be present in those places. Young people with disabilities tell us they want to take challenging classes and go to college and pursue a college degree. They want to share their gifts in the workplace. They want to be part of a caring community. But it's hard to belong or feel like you belong if you're just not there. So it opens up some questions for us as we think about our communities. Where are the places that people spend time in our towns or in our counties? And what are the groups and the networks that people affiliate with? The faith communities, the civic groups, the sporting events and hobby clubs, the arts programs, the shopping malls, the farmers markets. To what extent are young people with developmental disabilities part of all of these great experiences your community has to offer? Do they have a presence? Think about your schools. Are students part of the classrooms and clubs and courtyards and school events that make up the life of your school? Are they part of the colleges and four-year colleges and community college programs that exist all throughout Montana? And I put a picture of a recent graduation ceremony from one of the programs in your state here that's an inclusive post-secondary program. What about our workplaces? Are young people with disabilities making contributions to the variety of businesses in your community? And what about your faith communities? Are people present in worship and religious education and service and fellowship? What is it that stands in the way of people being present? What are the barriers that we have to name if we're going to be able to break those down and move forward? Maybe it's barriers of attitude or awareness or expectation or invitation. Maybe it's barriers of our theology or our values, or we just don't have a big enough imagination to picture a community where there's a place for everyone. It's really hard to feel like you belong if you're not there, but this is just the starting point for belonging, being present. It's not our destination, and we really do have to think about how do we push further. In your handouts, there'll be a slide like this for every one of these 10 dimensions of belonging, just reminding you to think about this as a point of reflection. What are you doing well? How do you know? What could you do better or differently or next? Well, the solution often to absence is invitation, right? There's something powerful about being picked by someone else, something that's awful wounding when we're not. And it's so encouraging to know that other people want to be in your midst. And that's what being invited is. It's having your presence or participation sought out by someone else. And I think this is what we heard from young people and their families. There's something about being invited or pursued, and having that personal invitation is part of that sense of belonging. And those invitations still remain rare for some students in our communities and young people. Up on your screen are data from something called the National Longitudinal Transition Study. It was a study all across the United States of 13 to 16-year-olds, so teenagers with various disabilities. And you'll see on the screen the percentage of students with various disabilities who had not been invited to any other youth social activities in the last 12 months, the last year. That was true for half of all autistic high school students, a quarter of all students with intellectual disability. Right? The absence of invitations is striking. And I think for communities, what we're really encouraging them to do is be more generous and extravagant in those invitations. They're often just not thinking about this. And so when people aren't intentionally reaching out, they inadvertently leave people out. It's reflected in the quote I put up on your screen. One minister said, "It's not that we deliberately excluded people with disabilities. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all." And that was the problem. And I think that characterizes what we see in a lot of our towns and cities. Organizations are more and more willing to welcome people when they arrive, but they're not pursuing people who aren't yet there. And that's the difference between public schools, which are mandated to invite, and community organizations and workplaces and colleges and religious communities that's an option for them. But wow, it says something powerful when they do invite. We need you here. Like, that's the statement that it's making. How do we help our communities beyond these proclamations of being welcoming? Everyone's welcome, all are welcome, to actually starting to not just announce their welcome, but invite people to demonstrate that welcome. And that's a very different posture. And it often, I think for many families, many of you are families, you know this firsthand, you might see that announcement that everyone's welcome and wonder whether there's a little asterisk or a qualifier or something like the little question mark on the screen here that do they really mean me? And that's really important because in so many of our communities, there have been little asterisks to those proclamations of welcome. And so here's the place where we have to encourage and support community groups to do more inviting of young people who would love to receive just such an invitation. How can we guide them in this area? How can we help equip them to feel more confident and comfortable reaching out into their communities, to promote their awareness so that they begin to see that there are people missing from their communities? And how do we tap into their mission or theology or vision to call them to that work? Well, third, belonging involves being welcomed. And those early encounters matter. Like young people with disabilities and their families talk about this not merely being about what people say, but actually about how they feel in a community. And that's a really important reminder for those of you who are part of community organizations. It's not the host who determines what's welcoming. It's ultimately the guest. And so are we designing our activities and programs in ways that make sure that people with disabilities and their families are going to feel welcomed? And so that's an important part of it. And hospitality for people with developmental disabilities isn't complicated. It looks more like hospitality for anyone, about things like greeting people when they arrive, finding out their names, inviting them to other events, anticipating their needs, knowing their gifts and connecting them to opportunity, giving them valued roles, noticing when they're not there, and just following up to find out why. These are the kinds of messages that communicate, as they did to this parent of a teenager with developmental disabilities, that we felt like we were wanted. But they're gestures that a lot of members of our community need guidance and reminders to do as well. So if your community doesn't have a history of including people with disabilities, they might not know how to move forward in this area. They might benefit from guidance on how to engage people who might communicate differently or who require ongoing assistance or behave in unfamiliar ways. They might need guidance about how to talk about disability or how to design their programs and spaces with the entire community in mind. So we can help our employers and coworkers and educators and greeters and community members be more comfortable and confident in their interactions when someone arrives to their community for the very first time. Well, fourth, belonging is personal. It's about being known. And this isn't merely about people knowing your names. That's part of it. I mean, and every kid loves to hear their name shouted across a cafeteria or the playground or called upon on, but this is more than merely being known about. This is about being known as an individual and appreciated for all of who you are, being understood deeply and personally. And I think for some of our students with developmental disabilities, they're often almost like strangers in their own school. If they're spending their entire school day in separate classrooms or always on the periphery of school and community activities or classroom activities, the opportunities to develop relationships with other kids and staff in that school just becomes more limited and they become less known. So what's interesting about this dimension of belonging is this isn't merely about whether young people are known, but actually how they're known. Now, I'll park here just for a minute longer than the others, because I think so often when we think about the labels that we use as professionals to categorize children, whether that's autism or intellectual disability or learning disabilities or what are those, they inadvertently shape how children come to be known. And so often those definitions focus on people's struggles rather than their strengths. It focuses on the challenges people have rather than the incredible contributions they can make to their communities. The definitions up on the screen are ones I want you to promptly forget because they become an incomplete way to know someone. If this is all we know about someone, we're flattening their rich portrait of who they are and reducing them often to a single story. And yet there's this wonderful different way to come to know young people with developmental disabilities by their strengths and their gifts and their passions and all of the positive qualities that they bring to their relationships and to their communities. To know people by the things that remind us they are absolutely indispensable and not by things that imply that someone's incapable. Can we come to see the students in our midst, our family members, our coworkers, as having strengths and contributions and gifts that need to be received? This reminds me of a study we did about 10 years ago now, where we asked parents of 500 youth with autism or other developmental disabilities to complete something called the assessment scale for positive character traits. So this was an assessment that didn't focus on what someone couldn't do or struggled to do. It was one that focused on the strengths like kindness and humor, gratitude and empathy, optimism, and courage. And what you'll see as I go through this is the blue bar that I'm putting up, or blue, gray, greenish, is the percentage of parents who said that is a lot like my son or daughter with developmental disabilities. 93% of parents said my child is happy. 86% said they enjoy life and are thankful for life's simple pleasures. Most said their child has a great sense of humor. They're described as thoughtful or helpful to others, quick to demonstrate care for other people. Most of the families talked about their son or daughter being bothered or concerned or upset when someone else was distressed or uncomfortable. So they're empathetic. They said their children were courageous. They bounced back easily. They were quick to forgive. Can we find a place for these kinds of strengths in our schools and throughout our communities? How many of our schools would be enriched by finding a place for someone known for their gratitude or empathy or kindness? How many employers would love employees with those characteristics? And how many peers would be eager to develop a friendship with someone who's funny and happy and thoughtful? These are the enviable traits we try to cultivate in all of our students. And in fact, this is the key to successful transitions to life into the community, because strengths are often this point of connection. You may know this is National Disability, well, actually we just finished yesterday, National Disability Employment Awareness Month. One of our campaigns has been called Hire My Strengths, which simply makes the point that connections to the workplace are not facilitated by knowing everything someone can't do, but actually by becoming fluent in all the strengths a person has, and then trying to figure out where in our community does someone need exactly those strengths. Well, it's one thing to be included. It's another thing to actually be accepted. And real acceptance comes from being known personally, not from being known about, but known personally. I suspect that many of you on this webinar or who watch it later are parents. And when we interview parents about the markers of meaningful inclusion for their daughters and sons with disabilities, we hear things like this. We hear my child was welcomed without condition, treated like family, embraced for all of who they are. Those are the things we want to hear from families over and over and over. But when we talk to families in our projects about what they hear over and over from communities, we see quickly that we are a long way from that assurance of acceptance. These are the quotes that families tell us they hear. We're just not equipped to serve your daughter. We don't really do inclusion here. Maybe you feel more comfortable somewhere that has a special program, or we're not sure he'll really get much out of being part of our typical programs. I'm not sure we have the budget to make those changes. And yet in a community of belonging, no one should wonder whether there really is a place for them. How do we begin to help communities have different sorts of attitudes and expectations than what undergirds each of these quotes that you hear? How do we begin to help shift attitudes? This is really challenging work, I get that. But we do know as a field about some of the pathways for changing attitudes. We know that there's a place for sharing information and promoting awareness and education related to disability and inclusion. Check, do that. We know we can host activities that raise awareness and increase understanding. We do that all throughout the year. That's important. We also know there's power in what we model to others and in the stories that we tell and how we tell them. The more that we are reflecting, I think, high expectations and supporting shared activities, that we start to see attitudes start to move. But it turns out that the biggest predictor of attitude change isn't really the awareness and informational efforts, but it's the efforts we make to foster friendships and promote inclusive activities that ultimately change attitude more than anything else. It turns out it's supporting positive contact and interactions over time that ultimately changes attitudes. In other words, real acceptance doesn't come from learning about someone, but from coming to know someone personally. Because that's where your preconceived ideas about whoever is the other in your life start to get overturned. How do we get people to stumble into interactions and relationships that change their perspectives about the gifts and contributions that young people with developmental disabilities can make in their workplace, in their congregation, in their community? Well, 6, support is critical to belonging. And like anyone else, young people with developmental disabilities are gonna need support to be part of the life of their community. A lot of the supports are ordinary supports, like encouragement to participate, making connections between them and others, inviting them to serve, mentorship, maybe transportation or financial assistance. And other supports are gonna need to be much more individualized, maybe even more intensive. Some of our young people in our midst have more extensive support needs or complex communication difficulties or behaviors that challenge us. And we are going to have to apply more creativity and commitment to support them well. But a community that's marked by belonging, they would say this investment is essential. It's not optional. This is actually what makes participation possible. It's what makes being present possible. And so we have to learn to ask good questions about what supports matter most to a particular person. The best supports are determined one person at a time and one place at a time. So are your schools or your service systems using person-centered planning approaches to figure out which supports are going to be most beneficial for each person? And then are you building the capacity of your staff to support a diversity of individuals well in their workplaces and classes and programs? Are we encouraging peers to be natural supports to classmates and coworkers who might need that extra help? And are we revisiting those supports over time to make sure they continue to work well for each person? We want to think about supports intentionally in ongoing ways, but I also want to encourage you to think about non-professional supports, about natural supports, as we think about this task of making sure presence is possible. One of the things that I've been involved with in our own research has been to look at ways of involving peers in providing supports in our classrooms, in cafeterias, and extracurriculars, and even community settings. We call these peer-mediated approaches. You'll see some names on the bottom of the screen that describe different sort of variations of that. The point I want to make here is just that in almost every study that we have conducted, we find really noticeable advantages when students or young people are receiving support from same-age peers versus exclusively from professionals and paraprofessionals and others. How do we engage peers in these ordinary ways of providing support in the classroom, in the workplace, and elsewhere? You'll see in your handouts, if you want to learn more about those strategies I very quickly put up on the screen, we have links to free downloadable resources that guide you through how to set those up in your schools that might interest you. But I also want you to think out of the box about how you involve communities in providing supports, maybe in other unexpected ways. So one that comes to mind for me in our work with rural communities has been thinking about how we engage faith communities in addressing the employment needs of young people with disabilities. In the Putting Faith to Work project, we invited members of a local congregation to come alongside their fellow member with developmental disabilities to form a small team that identifies that young person's gifts and passions and sense of calling, and then begins to network through their congregation to find a place of business that needs exactly that sort of person. They tap into places where they work or where they shop or where they recreate to say, who could use someone just like this? And we're seeing some really powerful things. In that particular project, 60 young people with developmental disabilities got connected to jobs, not through the service system, but through communities being invited to come alongside them that have never really often been asked to do that sort of thing. They sort of think, oh, the service system will take care of that. But how do we invite the community to take care of that as well? And there's other ways to think about this in your community as well. Think about the other networks that are part of your local town, your Chamber of Commerce, for example, that might convene businesses and agencies to support the employment of people with disabilities. Or think about the civic groups in your community, Kiwanis Club and Lions and Moose and Optimist and Rotary, how could they play a role in supporting community involvement or promoting inclusive volunteer opportunities or identifying mentors or providing transportation or on and on and on? Think about who's in your midst that you might invite to play a role in support that's outside of the service system as well. Well, seventh is to be heard. And this is so important because the perspectives of young people with developmental disabilities are not always sought. So much of that history that I showed you earlier, it was the voices of professionals and parents that really were the most dominant. And the shift now is towards self-advocacy, and best practices really emphasize the importance of making sure that young people have a say in all aspects of their life. As much as possible, being part of a community that also yearns to hear your voice, that contributes to the sense of belonging. It's about being heard and having a seat at the table and being listened to and acknowledged, asked what you think, to have an influence. All of those tell you that your involvement matters and your insights matter as well. And I think that's a place for us to think of those of you who are educators or parents about how do you help equip your students or family members with developmental disabilities to learn and practice the skills they need to be able to share their preferences and their perspectives with others. The more people understand themselves, like their strengths and their needs and their interests and their goals, and the better they know their communities, the better position they are to advocate for themselves and to advocate for others. There's a place for providing instruction related to self-determination and advocacy and leadership that helps position people to be heard. And there's also some ways we can teach skills that enhance that self-determination. Skills like choice making, decision making, like problem solving and goal setting, self-advocacy, and even self-awareness. The guide on your screen you can download, particularly if you're a parent, you might be really excited about this, or if you work with families, you might share this with them. It's hundreds of ideas that come from parents that are written for other parents about how they can foster self-determination at home through ordinary routines and responsibilities at home to begin to help shape their sons and daughters to be that leading voice in their own lives. But I think there's a place here also for our communities. If you are an organization or a school or a business that has an advisory council or an organizational board or leadership roles or committees, are you making sure that people with disabilities are invited and encouraged and supported to contribute in those roles? There's something about having your advice or your opinion sought out. Are we making sure that we're also hearing the advice and opinions of young people with disabilities? That's part of helping us understand how we adapt our practices and how we gather to be more widely welcoming. When we're asking people those questions of what matters most to you, how might we become a place of belonging for you, for your family, and for others? Well, eighth, it's not good to be alone. And relationships are at the heart of belonging. It's about having people in your life who know you and accept you and who love you and need you and miss you when you're not there. That's at the heart of belonging. And so being befriended is just having others in your life who say, I choose you back. It's these relationships marked by reciprocity and this mutual affection, right? And you think about friendships, the ways they contribute to all of our own well-being, the way they give meaning to our lives and make us who we are and help us navigate challenges and bring us joy. Friendships matter, and it's just not good to be alone. We know that now. We're in an epidemic of isolation and loneliness, and for some people with development in our midst, that's even more amplified. All of the other dimensions of belonging I've talked about so far, you can kind of do them in the absence of relationships, right? You can be supportive and you can be welcoming and you can be accepting, but friendships take belonging deeper. And I think that this is a real important point of reflection, because when we think about the relationships that people have, whether thinking about your own relationships, your family members and your friendships, your acquaintances, your people who are paid to be part of your life, right? There are a lot of people that you have in your own life, all of whom are important for various reasons. And we would hope that your map of your relationships would be rich and full with names abounding in each of these circles. But when we reflect on these same sets of circles for many young people with developmental disabilities in this transition period or before or beyond, we don't really see a different number of names showing up. What we tend to see is those names showing up in different circles. Family members, absolutely, and a lot of professionals and paid supports. And the challenge we have is to think about how do we provide the opportunities and invitations and supports to begin to fill in those circles of friends and close companions. And here too, I think I found that the data bear out that these relationships can be so elusive for so many young people. This also comes from the National Longitudinal Transition Study. The data are a bit older now, but this is focused on young people with various disabilities 8 years after leaving high school. And you can see that only less than half of young adults who are autistic see friends outside of work at least weekly, and the numbers are a little bit better in other sort of disability areas and groups. This is a place that we've got to be super intentional about, because it doesn't happen automatically. And this is not an area that, as our communities open up in terms of access, that relationships automatically happen. We've done a lot of good work to advocate for rights and for access, and those things can do lots of very important things. But as Hans Reinder reminds us in his this wonderful article on the power of inclusion and friendships, he says that whatever rights and choice can do, they're not going to make me your friend. In other words, you can't legislate this, you can't mandate this. We have to be super intentional, though, about fostering relationships. As you think about the students that you work with or the people you support through your organization or your agency, can we name people in each person's life that they can eat with and walk with and celebrate with and cry with and play with and pray with and shop with and watch that big game with, or just do nothing with? And if we can't name anyone, then what does that say about the opportunities and supports we're providing? We can't call something inclusive or inclusion if there are no friendships and peer relationships. It's not integrated employment if there's no one at that workplace who knows her name. And it's not community living if there's not a community that knows and embraces the individual. And we've got to think like super intentionally about how do we create opportunities for those relationships to form. There's kind of a formula here. I put it in quotes because obviously there's not a friendship formula. But we know that when people are in shared activities around common interests or experiences, and that happens over time, you repeat that, and we make sure that people have valued roles in those activities and there's enough support to be part of them, that it turns out people start to develop friendships. They pick one another as friends. And so if this is true and it bears out in our own lives, it means we have to deepen our commitment to inclusive activities that exponentially expand the opportunities that people have to meet one another and develop friendships. Let's find out what people's interests and hobbies and passions are, and then facilitate introductions to other people who love those same things. There's a link in your handouts as well to a wonderful free guide on how to do this in your community out of the University of Minnesota from Angela Amato. My point in all this is that we have to be super intentional about creating ordinary opportunities for people to share a meal together, to participate in a favorite hobby, to take a stroll through the park, to join the same small group, to watch the big game together. It's ordinary gestures like that that so often don't take place outside of our service systems. And it also means our primary models for supporting people can't be separate or segregated, because we're just limiting the opportunities people have to meet one another and develop those kinds of friendships, which leads to the 9th dimension of belonging, which is to be needed. And the richest forms of community are marked by this reciprocity, where every person is recognized as having gifts and talents and stories and strengths that benefit the community. Right? This is leadership by people with disabilities and service by people with disabilities and ministry by people with disabilities. And we want to make sure that as we think about supporting participation, we're also doing that in ways that people come to feel valued and to be noticed and needed in their communities. Because when people are needed, then when they're not there, their absence is missed. And when you're missed, that's how you know you belong. So let's connect young people to experiences to having valued roles of volunteering, taking on leadership responsibilities, helping other people in need, serving in your faith community, having a paid job, assisting on a project, having a role on a team. All of that helps you have a role that makes you seem and be integral, even indispensable in a community. All right, the last of these 10 dimensions of belonging is just to be loved. And if you think about the lengths that we go for people we love and the way we make allowances and go the extra mile and avoid what's expedient and work for people's goods, you start to see what love has to do with belonging. Love is the thing that leads us to care about someone's flourishing all 7 days of the week, after we get out of school, after we clock out of work, beyond the benediction. And where love abounds, people talk about belonging being experienced as well. We don't talk a lot about love, but love is central to belonging. And if you know the work of Wolf Wolfensberger, a real pioneer in our field, part of the whole deinstitutionalization movement, he talked about healing for wounded people begins with these 3 messages. You are valuable, you are as valuable as any other person, and you are loved by those around you. And I think that's a really important point to remember. We want to connect people to communities where they can experience the love of others. That's the picture of belonging from the vantage point of young people with disabilities and our families and our projects. And it's a call, I think, to reflection as we think about the people that we serve or teach or support or love as our family members. And we think about the communities that they care about. Are they personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of the life of that community? Are they experiencing a warm welcome? Are they well known and are they known well? Are they accepted without condition? Are they provided the support they need to participate fully? Are their voices listened to and heard? Are they developing and deepening friendships with others? Are they seen as needed and indispensable and sharing their gifts with others and loved deeply and unconditionally? In each of those areas, what are we doing really well? What could we do better or differently or next? And how do we know? And I hope this resonates because this is probably actually not a portrait of belonging for people with developmental disabilities. It's really a portrait of belonging for anyone. These aren't special needs up on the screen. They're ordinary needs. They're the kinds of things that we want communities to be about for everyone. And they may need guidance on how to do these things for people with disabilities in their midst. So I hope you're seeing this as a journey towards belonging as one worth pursuing. And hopefully this initial introduction to this way of thinking about what it means to be a community or move communities starts to spur your own thinking about the kinds of action you might take in your town or in your county, in your part of Montana. We're going to talk next time a lot more about what this looks like practically to move in these directions. But let me leave you with a set of images to think about which of these, as you think about the communities you're part of, most closely reflects what you see in your midst. The communities you work in or learn in or worship in or live in, and what might be your next step as you think about moving forward in these areas. So thank you for the work you're doing in your part of Montana to change the landscape and to advocate and be a voice so that every community is really a place of inclusion and belonging. Not just the thin stuff that looks like it, but the deep stuff where we feel it and we know it and we're assured of it. I think that's our work as service systems and as teachers, is to create those kinds of communities. So just let me commend you for your work in that area and encourage you to begin to think about what you might do next. And I'll look forward to your questions if there are any, and to our conversation in just a couple weeks. So Kim, let me turn it back to you.
Wonderful. This is Kim Brown. Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. If you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the question or chat box. If you don't see that, look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, click on the white arrow in the orange box, and that should open the question area, and you can type your question in. In the meantime, a couple of closing remarks for you that I'd like to share. We do have a short evaluation that we ask you complete. The link to that is in the chat box right now. It will also be in the follow-up email that you receive. We look at all of the survey responses and we use those to shape future webinars and to try to do a better job. So please take the couple of minutes to fill that out. The second really important piece of information is that Dr. Carter will be back with us on November 20th for the second in the Belonging series. You do need to register separately for that. So if you've not registered yet for the November 20th session, please do so. I put the registration link in the question or the chat box. It also should be on the original invitation that you received. It's posted on our website, or you can email me and I can send it to you again, but be sure to sign up for that. The recording from today's session will be posted to our Transition and Employment Projects website. I put that website address in the chat or question box as well. It can take a couple of weeks to get that posted because we want to check the captions and we want to check the video and audio and make sure everything is high quality before we post it. So, any questions coming in, Dr. Carter or Teresa? I see lots and lots of thanks.
I'm not seeing any yet. While we're waiting on that, I would just add a comment that if you are in a community where you find that conversations about inclusion can be heated or erupted very different opinions about what a community should look like, I've been struck by how much this language about belonging takes the conversation in very different directions, in the sense that people debate inclusion often, but they never debate belonging. And so often it's an entry point to ask the question of what could we do in the school to really make sure all of these 10 aspects of belonging are lived out for all of our students, which often leads you right back to that issue of how do we help people be more included in the life of their school where belonging is much more likely to be supported. So it might give you some language also to connect to, I think, what schools already care about. They want every student to experience belonging, and so we're tapping into that shared mission and really highlighting that this might just be something that's less common for some of our students, and you're inviting the school in attending to all of these areas of belonging to help teach them to do this better for every student. So hopefully it's a helpful framework and a reflection tool to take back to your communities as well.
Thank you for the additional information. That's very, very profound and I think important in all of the work that we do and just in being together in community. For those of you who are in Montana and who are planning to attend the Montana Youth Transition Conference in Great Falls next week, I'll let you know that we do have a belonging session scheduled there. Unfortunately, we weren't thinking well enough in advance to invite Dr. Carter to join us in person. Maybe that can be a future goal of ours. But we will be doing a belonging session at the Youth Transition Conference. It will be Wednesday, November 6th in the afternoon from 3:45 until 5. So if you are at the conference, be sure to join us and we'll talk more about belonging and hopefully look at some of the things that Dr. Carter shared with us today and think about how those apply in our state and in our lives. Any final comments or questions or things that you'd like to say, Dr. Carter, before we let people go for the day?
Just gratitude for the ways you're moving things in your own communities in these directions, and an invitation to join us next time when we'll unpack some really practical ways that we can live these out within our schools and communities. So hope to see many of you back, or all of you back next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Dr. Carter, to Teresa for her moderation help, and to our captioning and our interpreting professionals. And thanks to all of you who joined us. Have a great rest of your day and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.